Hello, Drug Lit class. Welcome back to the lecture on guidelines and applying evidence to patient care. In this video, we'll go over the next two steps of the Marie model for clinical guidelines, assignment and assessment. In the first video, we talked about identifying the population and the purpose for the guidelines. In this lecture, we'll go through the rest of the PICO framework, the identification of the groups that you're comparing evidence for, and the outcomes which the guidelines are looking at to compare the groups. So for the first section, assignment, we'll be looking at how to identify the options, how to identify the evidence, and how to identify a decision-making approach for when you get the evidence. So how are you going to rank the evidence to build your recommendations for the broader community? So the first step in assignment is considering which options are going to be considered for your recommendation. This involves identifying the options that are going to be evaluated. So what is your intervention group and what are your control groups? For example, a group of colon cancer screening guidelines might compare sigmoidoscopy, colonoscopy, and virtual colonoscopy, but they should also identify options that are being omitted. So, for example, those same guidelines might not consider things like barium enemas or occult blood testing. In the same vein, we mentioned in the last lecture, United States guidelines might consider only drugs available in the United States, even though other drugs might be available in other countries or other methodologies might be more prevalent in other countries, like acupuncture or things like herbal remedies. So knowing which options are being considered must be laid out ahead of time before you actually start digging into the evidence itself. Here's a quick example from the hypertension guidelines showing that they're looking at clinical evaluation procedures for hypertension, so the actual diagnostic tests and then pharmacological and procedural treatments. Then we get to the actual evidence. The guidelines should state how the evidence is organized. This involves types of studies or trials where the evidence came from, and it's going to bring up that hierarchy of evidence that we've been looking at all semester, with meta-analysis at the top, randomized controlled trials below, and all the way down to expert opinion. Like the systematic review process that we talked about in our meta-analysis lecture, the authors of guidelines should state their systematic review process for the guideline as well. Are they only looking at RCTs, or are they also looking at observational studies, or are they looking at all of the literature taken together? When evidence is being combined from different sources, the authors need to tell you how they are organized and what specifically they're looking at, so you can look at evidence in terms of benefits, in terms of harms, and in terms of cost. Authors need to take into account what their recommendations are going to be based most heavily on. Are they looking at mostly a benefit, mostly a harm, or some combination benefit, harm, and cost? Taken together, this could be considered the net effectiveness of a recommendation. And again, you need to take this into account for all of these different things: the patient outcomes, the cost, the feasibility, and the quality of studies. The assignment part of this Marie model kind of demands of authors that you take all of these into account and you get your plan laid out up front so that when you find all the evidence, you know how to collate it together in order to make the best overall recommendation for clinicians and for patients. Here is a brief review of evidence in the hypertension guidelines. You can see in the underlying portion up top, it says literature searches focused on RCTs, but also included a lot of other sources like registries, observational studies, case series, cohorts, and even expert opinion. It goes on and on and on, and I'll let you review the rest of this section on your own. And the hypertension guideline is posted for you in the Canvas site for this module. And it's there for you to kind of delve a little bit deeper into how the methodology is laid out. And the last part of the assignment section of the Marie model is the decision-making approach. So the ultimate recommendation of benefits, harms, costs, or other issues will depend on how the underlying data is evaluated and combined. If your initial search from all your data sources comes out to be 500 articles, many of those articles will agree with each other in certain respects and disagree with each other in certain respects. So you have to weigh what your recommendation is going to be most heavily based on. It's not unusual for guidelines to separate benefits and harms from cost considerations. That's just based on how it works here in the United States, in which cost is a major issue in medical care. So if they're laid out separately, you can kind of have what's best for most people and what's best for most people who can afford certain medications. There are multiple ways to combine data. We talked about doing a meta-analysis, but we can also combine data in different ways in order to maximize potential benefits and to minimize potential harms, or to maximize what's called expected utility, which is a way of maximizing both benefits and harms for the most people. In other words, maximizing the average benefits for the average patient so that across the population, the most people overall get the most benefit. Okay, in the decisions of the hypertension guidelines, recognize the importance of cost-value considerations in certain guidelines when appropriate and feasible. An analysis of the value of a drug, device, or intervention may be performed in accordance with ACC/AHA methodology, and that methodology is spelled out further in the guidelines that's posted online. Okay, so we've just talked about the M in Marie, defining the population, and in the next section, we talked about the systematic review process of what drugs or therapies we're looking at and how we're going to assess them or account for them. So what's our decision-making process? Do we combine them? And then in the next section, we're going to focus on the assessment, define our outcomes, define where we're looking for all of our evidence, and then filling in holes in the available evidence when there is no evidence. Where are we finding the evidence that we're basing our recommendations on? Well, guidelines should identify specifically where their evidence is coming from when they're making these recommendations. This is important, as we know, because different study designs will provide different quality of evidence, and we need to know where they're getting their evidence from so that if we decide to dig into the literature ourselves, we can replicate their search. Guidelines should also provide specific information that will allow subsequent assessment of the quality of evidence. So what are the types of investigations and what are the inherent biases in those types of research designs? How many participants were in each study and which specific outcome measures are being used? Okay, so I'm not going to go all the way into this, but again, take a look at the methodology section in the hypertension guidelines that's posted and get a feel for how they build guidelines and how they're laid out. You can see in the top section here the recommendation-specific supportive text. This is under a specific recommendation in the guideline, and you can see they put high value or high emphasis on meta-analyses of RCTs because that is the highest quality of evidence. Then, looking specifically at the outcomes the authors are using. So again, outcomes can be benefits, harms, or they can be costs depending on the study that's utilized. And we discussed this in the assignment section a couple minutes ago. But the definitions used to assess outcomes need to be explicit because that's what you're looking at within each study that you pull. So for example, in the hypertension guidelines, how is hypertension being defined, and do all the underlying studies define hypertension that way? Over the years, the blood pressure goal has shifted significantly in the United States and the world. Some studies may have defined hypertension differently, and that might impact which studies you can or cannot include into your guideline recommendations. So I will let you read into these specific guidelines again in further detail. The ACC/AHA even have their own guidance in a separate document on how they measure outcomes in hypertension guidelines. So we have all of our sources of evidence and we have outcomes that we're going to look at, but what about if you're looking for evidence for specific population or intervention and that evidence just simply does not exist? That hasn't been studied. Evidence-based guidelines are built on quantitative evidence from well-conducted investigations whenever possible, but expert opinion is also used to form conclusions. We should always remember that there is that hierarchy, so we will put more onus on meta-analyses than RCTs, than observational studies, and then expert opinion. And in other words, any more formal type of research design carries more weight than an expert opinion. But sometimes expert opinion is literally all there is. Not everything in medicine has been studied. So when expert opinion is all there is, there's a couple ways to gain kind of a stronger form of expert opinion, and it's by pooling experts. So many guidelines will use what's called consensus conferences, where they invite different physicians and other clinicians who are at the top in their field or head researchers to come together to form some sort of consensus opinion that they feel is best for the overall population. That is one form of consensus building for expert opinion. The other form is called the Delphi approach. You will not be tested on these, but Delphi approach is a form of consensus building where you ask certain questions and then you email them out to different experts, and you start with a big list of recommendations and the experts vote on the recommendations to kind of dwindle them down and down and down until you have only a nice small set of recommendations that everyone agrees on. That is how you make expert opinion a little bit stronger, so that we're not depending on individual clinicians to make decisions based on experience. We're trying to standardize it within the clinical guidelines. That's the point of a guideline. Again, the hypertension guidelines do account for this as well. In the underlined section, you can see the expert opinion of this writing committee, and I've also included a little snapshot of the organization of the writing committee. You can see that there are representatives from nursing, pharmacy, various organizations, and a lot of physicians. So this is the end of video 2. In video 3, we'll start looking at different results, how we're ranking different types of studies against each other, and how we're assessing quality of evidence.